Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 320, The History of St. Petersburg. Last time, we covered the history of Russia's present-day capital, Moscow. Today, we will recount the history of the country's newest major city, St. Petersburg. But before we get started, I wanted to remind you that I will be speaking at the Intelligent Speech 2005 online conference along with some of the greatest history podcasters around. It will be held on February 8th, and the tickets are only $30 for the full day of amazing topics. It will be found at intelligentspeechonline.com. I'm also going to be doing a panel discussion with two other Russian history podcasters, Roberto Toro of Tsar Power and J.P. Bristow of the Russian Empire History Podcast. And we will be talking about Russian propaganda. So just go to intelligentspeechonline.com. You'll see the schedule there. It's a full day with 4 different rooms. You can choose which room and what topic you want to listen to. It looks incredible, so hope to see you guys there. Now, back to St. Petersburg. Before the Russians took over the region, a group of Swedish settlers built a fortress, Nyenskans, at the mouth of the Neva River in 1611, later called Ingermanland. The small town of Nyen grew up around this fort. The area became settled by a mix of different nationalities, including Finns, Germans, Estonians, and Russians. On May 12, 1703, during the Great Northern War, Peter I led a successful military invasion of the area to capture the fort. When Peter went on his journey, known as the Great Embassy, in 1697, he visited many of the major cities in Europe and noticed how different and better they were than those in Russia. Here is where he began to develop the idea of building a European capital, something more modern than Moscow. It was during the Great Embassy that the plans for St. Petersburg would begin. Peter had a real deep disdain for his capital, Moscow. It brought back dark memories of his relatives being slaughtered by the reactionary forces of the Streltsy and the rule of his half-sister, Sophia. Everything about the old capital annoyed the Tsar. The decision to build a city like St. Petersburg, in the place that Peter selected, was best described by author Orlando Figes in his book, Natasha's Dance. Quote, "On a misty spring morning in 1703, a dozen Russian horsemen rode across the bleak and barren marshlands where the Neva River runs into the Baltic Sea. They were looking for a site to build a fort against the Swedes, then at war with Russia, and the owners of these long abandoned swamps. But the vision of the wide and bending river flowing to the sea was full of hope and promise to the Tsar of landlocked Russia, riding at the head of his scouting troops. As they approached the coast, he dismounted his horse. With his bayonet, he cut 2 strips of peat and arranged them in a cross on the murky ground. Then Peter said, 'Here shall be a town.'" I don't think it's possible to have selected a worse site than the one the Tsar chose. But Peter never did anything ordinary and safe. The Great Northern War, which began on February 22nd, 1700, was raging, and the Russians needed a strong outpost in the area. Still, the thought of finding a way to build a city on ground where water was found just 1 meter below the surface seemed extraordinarily hard. Yet, it would be done in an amazingly short time. The day of St. Petersburg's founding is May 27, 1703. In 9 years, enough of the city had been built to move the capital of Russia there from Moscow. The first building to be completed was the Peter and Paul Fortress, built on Zayachki Island, also known as Hare's Island, on the right bank of the Neva. approximately 3 miles inland from the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic Sea. Up until this time, Russia was mainly a landlocked country, and Peter, with his affinity for boating, desperately wanted a port to dock his navy. But the city had one other use. It was the gateway to Europe, a direction that Peter wanted his country to head in. Peter, and later Catherine II, imported famous European architects to design the numerous palaces that would dot the city's landscape. Much of the decorative stones that would be used were imported from countries like Finland, Italy, the Middle East, and within his own country, the Urals. The only stone that came from local sources was limestone. During the early years, Peter was involved with all sorts of decisions having to do with the city's building, even when the war with Sweden was in full swing. The Tsar wanted to emulate the finest buildings he encountered during the Great Embassy. But all these grandiose architectural designs came at a great cost in both money and lives. There are varying estimates of how many people worked on the construction of St. Petersburg. What is known is that Tsar Peter ordered 40,000 peasants to report to the city, paying their own way and supplying their own rations. This was achieved by forcing every 9 to 16 households to supply one worker. For the wealthy, it would be a serf, and for the peasants, it would be a family member. This would be on top of the mandatory military service that Peter required. Many would die on the way to St. Petersburg, with tens of thousands losing their lives during construction. The callous disregard for the suffering of those involved in the building of the city stains it to this day. It would also increase the hatred felt for the Tsar by both the nobility and peasantry. As I said, the first building completed in St. Petersburg was the Peter and Paul Fortress in 1720. It was designed by Swiss architect Domenico Trezzini. From the early 1700s until 1920, it was a prison for political dissidents. After 1924, it served as a museum. As the marshlands were drained, architects and engineers, primarily German, Italian, and Dutch, designed the stone buildings that would dot the landscape. Tsar Peter halted using stone to build houses throughout Russia so that all the stonemasons would only work in his new city. Peter's recruitment of Europeans did not stop there. He would call for experts in shipbuilding, sciences, and those with new ideas for running businesses. This would turn St. Petersburg into a cosmopolitan city, a far cry from Moscow's purely Russian feel. These new immigrants would cause Peter's hatred to come to a boil, with several attempts on his life and his own son, Alexei, betraying him. Despite protestations and threats against the Tsar, he moved the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg in 1712. It would remain the capital until Peter II moved it back to Moscow in 1728. Of course, the young Tsar died in 1730 at the age of 14, and his successor, Empress Anna, made St. Petersburg the capital yet again in 1732, where it would remain until the Bolshevik Revolution. While the city was being constructed, the Russians and the Swedes, as I've said a few times, were involved in the Great Northern War. When Peter claimed victory with the signing of the Treaty of Neustadt in 1721, the safety of this new city was complete until, of course, 1941, when it was encircled by the Nazi army, beginning the siege of Leningrad. That would last until January 1944, encompassing 29 months. The first person to build a home in St. Petersburg was Norwegian-born naval officer Cornelius Croix. He would become the first commander of the Russian Baltic Fleet. Croix was the architect of the Imperial Russian Navy, something that was a dream of Tsar Peter the Great. While his house, built of wood, would not survive very long, the site where it was built is now known as the Kotoman House, which was constructed between 1812 and 1815 on what is now the Nevsky Prospect. While at his great embassy, one of the palaces that made the biggest impression on Peter was Versailles. He greatly admired the building, which was the basis for the construction of Peterhof. The first building was known as the Montplaisir Palace, which translates from French to mean my delight. Tsar Peter himself made the original sketches for the palace's designs. The first architect was our friend Domenico Trezzini, who worked on it between 1714 and 1728. Trezzini is credited with creating the style which became the foundation for the Petrine Baroque. This is the style that would come to dominate the Petersburg skyline for years to come. Another important figure in the development was Jean-Baptiste Alexandre Leblanc, who designed the gardens. Francisco Bartolomeo Rastarelli would be employed by Empress Elizabeth to complete an expansion of Peterhof between 1747 and 1756. The Palace Ensemble Complex and the city center are recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In 1716, Prussia's King Frederick William I presented a gift to his ally during the Great Northern War, Tsar Peter, and it's the now missing Amber Room. Originally intended for the Charlottenburg Palace in Berlin, it was eventually installed at the Berlin City Palace. The gift to Peter was a gesture that would help persuade the Russian leader to cede Swedish territory to Prussia, as the war was looking more and more likely to be a Russian victory. The room would be dismantled by the Nazi occupying forces sometime in 1941 and taken to Königsberg for reconstruction and display. Unfortunately, no one knows what happened to the original Amber Room. It has been carefully reconstructed, though, based on photographs taken of it before the war. Donations from Germany and Russia allowed for the costly rebuild, which was completed in 2003. More intellectuals, business people, and nobility began to move to the new capital. Workers, of course, followed in droves and began to populate the surrounding area despite the poor conditions. The capital would also contain a growing naval presence where my family would join in with one of my relatives. And I'm thinking it's, from the pictures I can see and what I've been able to read, it was my great-grandfather who became an admiral in the Russian Navy. Under Peter's daughter, Elizabeth, we will have the next big surge in the number of buildings in the capital. The construction of the Winter Palace and the Smolny Cathedral are two of the finest examples of her influence in the expansion of St. Petersburg. Of course, her favorite was the Italian architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli, whom I mentioned earlier. While Elizabeth commissioned the expansion of palaces like Peterhof, her piety showed another side to her, or, as historian Robert Nisbet Bain wrote, quote, "No other Russian sovereign ever erected so many churches." Under Elizabeth, St. Petersburg became the center of Russian society. The opulent galas and the gifts bestowed on the nobility made the capital the place to be. The empress set up the city for her daughter-in-law, Catherine II. Catherine would take the city to new heights, both architecturally and socially. She helped usher in the age of Russian Enlightenment, which included the establishment in St. Petersburg of the Smolny Institute of Noble Maidens, the very first state-financed higher education institution for women in all of Europe. Catherine's policies would make the Russian capital a beacon for immigration from other European countries. Russia, particularly St. Petersburg, was being recognized as a truly European city. The empress enticed scientists like Leonhard Euler and Peter Simon Pallas to emigrate from Berlin, and Anders Johann Lexell from Sweden to come to the Russian capital. One of St. Petersburg's unfortunate features was the incredible disparity between the wealthy and the poor. Catherine understood this, but did very little to alleviate the situation. While she has helped establish hospitals and homes for orphans, it is just a proverbial drop in the bucket compared to the plight of the poor. This would eventually lead to tensions building up that would become the Russian Revolution. Catherine was also most involved in two other significant additions to the capital: the building of the Hermitage Museum and the expansion of the home of future czars, Tsarskoye Selo. The Chinese village was designed by Scottish architect Cameron, and however, they originally wanted a Chinese architect to develop it, but they couldn't find any. Revolts and revolutions would be part of St. Petersburg's history, beginning in 1825 with the Decembrist Revolt. It was a failed coup d'etat that led to the execution of 5 leaders and the banishment of 15 others. It would be the first major crack in the Romanovs' leadership. It would not be the last. After Nicholas I passed and Alexander II took the throne, many of these Decembrists were pardoned. What was unusual was that most did not return to St. Petersburg, preferring to stay in exile, actually preferring the relative freedom of living in Siberia to, quote, the stifling intrigues of Moscow and St. Petersburg. It wasn't just the lower classes that were unhappy with what was going on in St. Petersburg. It was also the intelligentsia and a number of the nobility. St. Petersburg were full of reminders of the Romanovs' family wealth, which was staggering even by today's standards. Resentment grew over the years, and intrigues about the behavior of the Romanovs and the upper echelon of society grew exponentially. One of the most famous examples of this was the relationship between Nicholas II, his family, and Grigory Rasputin. Within high society of St. Petersburg, sides were taken, reducing people's respect for the Tsar. The lessening of respect by the upper class was preceded by grumblings from the lower classes. This would grow in earnest with the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. They would flood the suburbs, stretching the capacity of the city to house them. By 1900, St. Petersburg was Europe's 4th most populated city, a center of business and one of the largest industrial hubs. As we all know, this was soon to come to an end. The first significant rumblings of anger, as we know it, is the January 1905 revolution. While there were other revolts going on throughout the Russian Empire, St. Petersburg was the center of turmoil. Of course, this was the case as it was both Tsar Nicholas's capital and his home. Within Russia in the preceding decade before 1905, there were over 1,700 strikes for various reasons. St. Petersburg and Moscow were the most vibrant of the anti-government sentiments. In October 1905, the Petersburg Soviet of Workers' Deputies was formed during the general strike that paralyzed the city. At first, the Soviet was not held in much regard by the Bolsheviks, as they viewed it as kind of a competitor. The Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, led by Leon Trotsky at the time, were at the forefront. It was in the cities that much of the revolutionary fervor resided, as rural Russia sided with the Tsar. When World War I broke out, it was decided to change the city's name to the supposedly more Russian-sounding Petrograd. Why the notion that St. Petersburg sounded more German is beyond me, but they made that decision. The people of the capital weren't necessarily buying it, as Nicholas II was 97% German, and his wife, she was actually German-born. Now, Petrograd and Moscow were the two major cities where the Revolution of 1917 occurred. The capital, though, was the place where the most important events occurred. After the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government in October, they quickly had to find ways to consolidate their power. One of their first concerns was their own safety in Petrograd, as it was not that far away from the war front at the time. This caused Lenin to move the capital, ostensibly to Moscow, on March 5th, 1918, and it has not reverted back since. The former capital would be renamed Leningrad on January 24th, 1924, 3 days after Lenin's death. Since St. Petersburg was the home of so many of the bourgeoisie of Russia, it would suffer the greatest during the Red Terror, which lasted, the original one, from September 1918 until February 1922. It was initiated due to the assassination of Moisey Uritsky on August 17, 1918, outside the Petrograd Cheka headquarters, as well as Fanny Kaplan's attempt on Lenin's life in Moscow 13 days later. The terror would not be the last tribulation that Leningrad would go through. The worst was yet to come. On September 8, 1941, the Nazi Wehrmacht began the siege of Leningrad, which was to last for 29 months, ending on January 27, 1944. It would take the lives of approximately 1.2 million people, with 650,000 dying in 1942 alone. The human suffering, along with the devastation of having the Nazi army firing over 150,000 shells at Leningrad, and the Luftwaffe dropping about 100,000 bombs as well. What followed the lifting of the siege was a complete rebuild of the city. The government had to rebuild thousands of buildings, including numerous industries, schools, transportation systems, energy producers, and infrastructure. It would take over 25 years to accomplish this feat. They also had to restore a number of destroyed museums, palaces, and other historic and cultural landmarks and treasures. There were also hundreds of landmines left behind that would cause numerous deaths among citizens for many years to come. The leadership of the city during the siege showed great bravery, making them extremely popular. But this really irked Joseph Stalin, which caused him to create a scandal known as the Leningrad Affair. Many of the leaders, like Alexei Kuznetsov and Nikolai Vozhensky, were arrested and executed due to the trumped-up charges. Thousands more were arrested and sent to the gulags. Despite producing 6% of the Soviet Union's GDP, with only 2% of the population, Leningrad was looked down upon by the Bolshevik government. Repressions continued for decades, and monies were diverted to other cities, especially Moscow. On September 6, 1991, after the fall of the USSR, voters chose to revert to the city's original name, St. Petersburg. The oblast retained its Leningrad name, with Petersburg as its capital. The highest court in Russia, the Constitutional Court, moved back to the city in 2008, restoring some of its historical significance. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Join me next time when we cover the history of the oldest major city of the people known as the Rus, Kyiv. But don't forget, IntelligenceSpeechOnline.com, where you can hear me and other history podcasters discussing the concept of this conference, which is deception, something that everybody who knows anything about Russian history would know about. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.